Good day. Welcome one and all to the 20th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. I'm Dan Atrell, and today we're going to talk about Achaemenid religion. Today we're going to get back to Persia, so I can then carry on with our chronology in a later lecture. If you remember from previous lectures, it was the military genius of Cyrus the Great, which led to the defeat of the Medes in 550 BC, and the unification of the Indo-Iranian people under the aegis of a single dynasty, the Achaemenid dynasty. This dynasty endured until the arrival of Alexander the Great into Persia, which would put an end to a good deal of fighting between the Greeks and the Persians, the likes of which we've discussed and will continue to discuss in later lectures, probably with the help of some friends of mine. But specifically, what I want to talk about today is how a Persian magus, who'd eventually be known to us as Zarathustra, or through the mangled Greek version of his name, Zoroaster, and how he changed the course of world history with his whole new set of ethical and cosmological principles. He's called Zardasht in Persian, and that got me wondering if the movie Zardoz has anything to do with him, but that's beside the point. He's sometimes called a prophet, and I think this attribution is fair. A prophet is just someone who speaks on behalf of a god. He's a mouthpiece, if you will, not a god in and of himself. Whether or not he was an actual historical person who's been dated to everywhere between 1200 BC and 600 BC is, as usual, beside the point. What matters to us is the myth behind the man, not the man behind the myth. Because it's this myth which will have the greater impact on history than the story of the quote-unquote real man himself. Remember, all is mind. If it's more pleasing to you, you could call him a sage or a wise man, which is ultimately what's intended by the word magus, and this would have some import in Greek, it has Western perceptions of Zoroastrianism, and eventually the occult in general. I'll get to these Magi in some detail. Ultimately, to us, Zarathustra is a literary figure who acts as a sort of repository for knowledge. He's like a figurehead or an archetype for wisdom itself. He's like Moses or Hermes Trismegistus or Buddha or whatever. The Hellenistic world, especially in the Seleucid realms, were fascinated by this Zoroaster, whom the Greeks thought, erroneously I might add, to be quote-unquote Chaldean, that's Babylonian, and they thought he was the founder of the Magi and the inventor of both astrology and magic. So, scholars have been arguing ad nauseum about whether the Zoroaster is one person, whether he's a group of people, whether he's factual, whether he's mythical, when and where he lived and died, and so forth. I'm not going to do this here. It's not important to our purposes. What matters to us is that there is this looming figure in our intellectual tradition that I was totally going to omit, but since I'm talking about Persia, I remembered that this subject is of utmost importance to our overall picture, especially in regards to the evolution of magic, religion, mystical philosophy, and so forth. Now, people place the location of the Zoroaster's birth around northeast Iran or southern Turkmenistan. Others place it in southern Kazakhstan. These sorts of details aren't worth debating, like I mentioned. Zarathustra would have been contemporary to the poets of the Rig Veda. living among the people who shared their ancestry with the Indo-Aryan horseback warriors who swept into India around 1750 BC, bringing in the Vedic culture and the Sanskrit language. Zarathustra is said to have imparted his own teachings via 5 hymns known as the Gathas, and this makes sense. Poetry was a very, let's say, Brahmanic way to get your word out. Now, to know anything about the teachings of Zarathustra, we have to look at the Avesta. This is a body of sacred texts written in Avestan, which is very closely related to Sanskrit. Now, a problem with this specific text that faces modern historians is that our oldest surviving manuscript of the Avesta is only 800 years old. So, who knows what's quote-unquote original and what's the product of later redactions? We can be sure that most of these writings, like the Vedas as well, were passed down orally long before they were written down. So there's probably a whole lot of retro-projection going on. But again, to us, that's mostly irrelevant. It's the teachings themselves and their influence that are valuable, not their specific authors. But let's at least remember one thing. The Persians are Indo-Iranians. Though they would ultimately rub shoulders and eventually conquer many great Semitic powers in Mesopotamia, they were descended from an entirely different tradition, religiously, linguistically, and culturally, from groups like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or the Hebrews. It was fashionable in the past to see the Achaemenid Empire as somehow derivative of these people. But I think we need to see at least the pre-Islamic Persians as their own unique phenomenon. It was more like a mix of traditions between, let's say, steppe nomadism, Vedic warrior aristocracy, and the Semitic agricultural civilizations. The East Iranian culture of this period had lots of affinities with the Vedic culture, and so the position which Zarathustra would have held would have been something analogous to that of a Brahmin. Another parallel which is often evoked between these two traditions is their devotion to Soma in the Vedic tradition, or Halma in the Avestan. Now, among modern Zoroastrians, Ephedra sinica, a plant containing the stimulants ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, is used as a surrogate plant. But when we try to guess what the Soma or the Halma of the ancients was, we've got a handful of candidates. We've got Amanita muscaria mushrooms containing the GABA agonists ibotenic acid and muscimol. We've got psilocybin containing mushrooms, which contain the serotonergic indole-based tryptamine psilocin. We have Peganum harmala containing harmaline, which is an MAOI that can be used to unlock the hallucinogenic potential of acacia or other serotonergic dimethyltryptamine containing plants. This is like an Iranian ayahuasca, if you will. Cannabis is another option, specifically in its orally ingested form, such as in the form of bhang, which is a traditional cannabis milk drink still drunk in India, and others still have even argued for the sacred lotus, Nelumbo nucifera. Now, I have experience with and working knowledge of all these plants, and if I had to place my bets on something, it would be either the psilocybin mushrooms or the Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I wrote my master's thesis in part on this subject, but I don't want to rule out the other options either, except maybe the lotus, which is a very, very mild and warm aphrodisiac. It's got sensations similar to, let's say, a very light dose of cannabis. It's hardly the sort of thing which can generate kind of these vast images of immeasurable light beings with hundreds of eyes and hundreds of hands. But who knows? I mean, they very well could have found some way to concentrate any of these plants and make them each potent substances in their own rights. Just as a side note, you can get two kinds of lotus, Nelumbo nucifera, or white lotus from China, or you can get blue lotus, which is Nympharum caerulea, which was traditionally used by the Egyptians. These two plants actually aren't related, despite both being called lotuses. And for some reason, they have the same chemical which works on an opioid receptor. Now, from my experience, the blue lotus is way better, albeit still subtle. It's like an extremely low dose of MDMA. You can smoke the blue petals or drink it in a tea. I do this from time to time, but I try not to overdo it since I have no idea what the health ramifications are in the long term. In any case, during this Iranian tribal period when Zarathustra is believed to have lived, the Indo-Iranian people were polytheists. They worshipped a variety of gods, as did all good Indo-European peoples at the time, whether Greek or Germanic or Norse or Celtic or whatever. Among these many gods was the god Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, who would become the highest of all the gods in the Zoroastrian faith. This all happened through a process which occurred among the Hebrews as well. It's a sort of move from polytheism, which was practiced in Canaan, to henotheism, which is a belief in one god above many, to monotheism, which is a strict belief in one god. So, among the Indo-Iranians, we had polytheism. Among the Persians, we had henotheism. And in later iterations of Sassanid Zoroastrianism in the ADs, this is sometimes called Zurvanism, we get a sort of hypostatized monotheism, or a monotheism broken up into layers. So, Zarathustra's project was not entirely oriented around parading one god above other gods. It's safe to put him in the category, and perhaps he was even the first, of the so-called axial age teachers. He was part philosopher, part ethical teacher, and part magician, if you will. According to tradition, he left home at the age of 20, possibly having already undertaken the arduous training required of Brahmanhood. And then at the age of 30, he received a powerful vision, who knows under the influence of what. And this led him to begin to preach this new and highly original, quote-unquote, Gnostic message. The prophet Zarathustra had an ethical project. This was one which prioritized truth, or asha, over falsehood, or illusion. Does this sound familiar to you? Zarathustra lifted Ahura Mazda to a position of supreme godhood, but he didn't make him the only god. At this point, it would have been too apparent. Obviously, other gods exist. They were everywhere you looked. Their statues, their priests, their rituals, their ceremonies. The gods were ubiquitous in the minds of men during Zarathustra's lifetime. Nevertheless, it became apparent to Zarathustra that it was Ahura Mazda who created mankind and then gave him free will. And then it was on account of this free will, the world would ultimately be broken up into two camps: the followers of truth and the followers of falsehood. Now, this sort of concept might seem all too familiar to us, what with dichotomies like Christendom and the pagan world, or the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, the house of peace and the house of war. But this sort of thing didn't exist in the Bronze Age, and it was a totally revolutionary way to see the world intellectually. And it began here with Zarathustra. Humans were given the free will choice between truth and illusion. If we look on the Emperor Darius's tomb, we see that it reads, quote, "I support what is right and am no friend of the lie." Herodotus would tell us that growing up, the three most important things Persian children were taught to do was ride a horse, shoot an arrow, and never tell a lie. Another idea which some people believed Zarathustra introduced, though I disagree since I'm reminded of Egypt and the halls of Amenti, and that's the idea of a final judgment. Hell awaited those who did evil, and paradise, which is actually a Persian word for garden, the garden of a renewed world, that awaited those who did good. Now, the Zoroaster did not abolish animal sacrifice, but he did prescribe some reforms toward curbing excessive attention made toward this practice. He also had a few things to say about the strict use of halma. I'm not sure if these reforms are responsible for prompting his death, but tradition goes that Zarathustra was assassinated by the priest of a rival religion at the age of 77. As with most religious traditions, women were thought of as being more prone to evil, but despite this bias, there was actually no formal dogma concerning the inferiority of women. According to the Gathas, which are the texts directly attributed to the Zoroaster, men and women both have free will, and thus equal responsibility toward the truth. I think I mentioned in my last lecture that Persia didn't have a system of widespread institutionalized slavery, and I think that this was as a result of the positive influence of Zoroastrianism and its respect toward human will. Now, as the tradition goes, Zoroastrianism didn't spread explosively like, say, Islam or Christianity. Rather, it expanded gradually after a local ruler took a liking to Zarathustra and helped him promulgate his new doctrines. Slowly, Zoroastrian ideals spread westward into the rest of Iran, where they were incorporated with older polytheistic traditions, most notably with an eye for the stars and the planets. This big ol' syncretism would ultimately become the state religion of the world's very first world empire. Now, just a side note. These people didn't call themselves Zoroastrian. That's more of a modern term. They would have just considered themselves worshippers of Ahura Mazda, and this was never enforced as an exclusive form of monotheism. Everywhere the Persians conquered, they picked up bits and pieces of the other local religions, and then they syncretized them with their own. This would explain the survival of Egyptian polytheism under Persian rule. It would also explain something like the restoration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem by the Emperor Darius. When Darius invaded Greece, he even extended his protection to the shrine of Apollo at Delos, which was considered the very navel of the Greek world, regardless of the fact that he was at war with Greece. When they burned down the Acropolis, it's said that the emperor regretted it immediately. It was a holy site, after all. Now, given the polytheistic context that he lived in, it appears, unlike, say, Buddha, Pythagoras, Jesus, or Muhammad, Zarathustra taught the existence of numerous other semi-independent divine abstractions, or devas. This word is etymologically related to the Latin divus, divine. So, in addition to acknowledging the existence of many gods, the Zoroastrians also worship the elements, most notably fire, which would become synonymous with the light of the soul, or the intellect, or consciousness, in addition with the light of the sun. Water was also a very important element of Persian culture, with its elaborate use of underground springs, its complex irrigation systems, and its lavish gardens elaborately constructed over arid wastelands. Water was divinized in the Avestan language as a goddess named Zurvanism. Her portfolio also includes the domains of healing, fertility, and wisdom. She was sometimes syncretized with the Semitic goddess Ishtar or Inanna, or the Greek Artemis or Venus, depending on who you asked. She was often depicted with 4 horses. These represented wind, rain, cloud, and sleet. And it was said that, quote, all the waters of the world created by Ahura Mazda originate from the source Aredvi Sura Anahita. The life increasing, the herd increasing, fold increasing, who makes prosperity for all countries. So this gives you some idea of why water was so central to Persian life. Well, I suppose it's central to all our lives, but surprisingly, water deities aren't as important in many other pagan societies. But I digress. Now, later Zoroastrianism, we have to remember that this religion continues to exist even today, albeit as a persecuted and shrinking endogamous minority group with a population of up to 2.6 million worldwide. These folks had a more fleshed out concept of dualism and a focus on the negative principle called Ahriman or Angramanu. But during the Achaemenid period, it doesn't seem that this kind of, let's say, satanic figure was very fleshed out. Of course, we have lots of images of Ahura Mazda, especially on things like tombs, and here he's depicted as a man seated in a winged solar disk. Nevertheless, in the early period of Persian history, it's safe to say they hadn't moved into henotheism. Another notable difference between ancient and later Zoroastrian tradition concerned burial rites. Modern Zoroastrians leave their dead exposed in these sorts of open-faced towers to get stripped by carrion birds, whereas ancient Zoroastrians buried their dead. Factors like these were all historical developments. Zoroastrianism, like most isms, is not some monolithic entity which experienced no change over time. For the sake of ease, some call Achaemenid Zoroastrianism Mazdaism, to distinguish it from other traditions like Sassanid Zurvanism, Mandeanism, Manichaeism, and so forth. Now, I suppose we can't talk about Zoroastrianism without briefly mentioning a thing or two about the differences between so-called Mazdaism and Zervanism. The latter being a later branch of Zoroastrianism, and the former being its mainstay, which survives onto this day. In Zervanism, we've got the description of a first principle, or let's say the one, who is said to have engendered two equal but opposite forces. Ormazd, id est Ahura Mazda, and Ahriman, id est Angra Mainyu. These are light and darkness, good and evil, and so forth. So, in this way, a Zurvanist might see things from what we'd call a more Taoistic perspective than what we'd call a strict Manichaean perspective. Good and evil are locked in duality forever. Their strife is really the underlying substance of the one, or Zurvan, which is the reconciliation of these opposites. Zurvan was the transcendental and neutral god. He suffered no passions, and he saw no distinction between good and evil. All of these things were reconciled in him. Good and evil, then, is not a problem that needs to be dealt with. It's just the way the world operates. Zurvan, then, was the infinite god of time and space. This explains why they use the name Zurvan, which comes from the Avestan word Zruvan, which is time. Interestingly enough, this is a grammatically neuter term in respects to gender. Now, time became more and more of a preoccupation with the Zoroastrians as the years went by. All of history, the whole cosmos, if you will, was thought to last a mere 12,000 years, divvied up into 4 sets of 3,000 years. The first age was called the Mental Age, when Ormazd began his creative activity and his war with Ahriman. They mingled together for 9,000 years, and this marks a shift from the mental to the material state. During the Third Age, Ahriman assaults Ormazd's creation, and then at the end of this period, the good god prepares for the coming of a prophet, whose revelations would usher in a fourth and final age. So during the 3,000 years that are left, a savior appears every 1,000 years, the last of whom washes away and revitalizes the world. This sort of vision of history in phases would have a profound impact on human consciousness and would be reiterated in all sorts of forms throughout history. Joachim of Fior had his 3 ages, the age of the Father, which is the Old Testament period, the age of the Son, which is the New Testament period, and then the age of the Spirit, which is all the time after that. We might also compare this breakdown to the yugas of Hinduism, or the eons of Thelema, or the breakdown of time according to astrology. Scholars interested in this subject have assumed that this figure, Zurvan, emerged as a way to fix a number of inconsistencies in the sacred Avestan texts. This process took place during the second half of the Achaemenid period, so let's say starting a bit before the year 400 BC. But we really don't know when or where Zervanism started, but we do know that it rubbed shoulders with Hellenistic and Indic thought, with the coming into Persia of Alexander the Great and his armies, and then long after that it enjoyed royal sanction during the Sassanid period, which is, let's say, 226 AD to 651. Then, following the conquest of Persia by Islam, Zervanism fizzled out entirely by the 10th century, having largely been subsumed or syncretized with Islam, who also held dear to one great transcendent being. What we don't know is whether Sassanid-era Zurvanism and Mazdaism would ever become separate sects, each with their own priesthoods and rituals, or if these were simply 2 tendencies within one body. Some scholars have said that we can infer the fact that Mazdaism and Zurvanism competed with one another from the works of Christian and Manichaean polemicists, but these doctrinal inconsistencies were not so extreme that, quote, they could not be reconciled under the broad aegis of an imperial church. In any case, we're way off base here chronologically, so let me talk about Mazdaism, which I think has more relevance to the Achaemenid era. We can contrast Zurvanite Zoroastrianism with Mazdaism, which is the more Manichaean form of Zoroastrianism, and I mean Manichaean in its loose form, not its strict historical form, which I realize is confusing, specifically given our current topic. But in Mazdaism, there are two beliefs, one ancient and one modern. In the ancient view, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are themselves primordial beings. There is no reductio ad unum, if you will. The world has always been the result of binary processes. The gods are omniscient, but not omnipotent. Then, we've got the 19th, 20th century version of Mazdaism, in which Ahura Mazda is basically the same thing as Zorvan, the highest principle, or the One, and thus is even perceived as the origin of Angra Mainyu. But we needn't get into this now. I don't intend on talking about actual Manichaeism until we reach the 3rd century AD, so we've still got a good 600 years to plow through. Anyhow, all this hair splitting, of course, is implicit to the problem of theodicy. Theodicy is a fancy word for any attempt to answer the question of how a good God can allow evil to exist. And it would be in no way a problem particular to Persia. This sort of question would eventually be of extreme importance to the church fathers in the West, like Origen, Augustine of Hippo, and Irenaeus of Lyon. We can also see the Hebrews wrestling with similar questions in works like the Book of Job. Every time I think of the problem of theodicy, I'm reminded of one summer when I'd taken a good amount of some reality-dissolving substance some of you might be familiar with, and then I had 2 Jehovah's Witnesses knock at my door. Well, the first thing they asked me was, why do you think God allows bad things to happen to good people? To make a long story short, let's just say I left them with more questions than they believed they could provide answers for. And ultimately, I was just as astonished at how these 2 little old ladies, with the help of a single glossy Watchtower magazine as their limitless font of wisdom, could topple a problem which had been plaguing our best thinkers for thousands of years without batting an eyelash. All in a day's work, I suppose. Now, to give you the big picture for a moment, Zoroastrianism might be said to have existed in 6 phases. The first of these phases is a formative phase that preceded the rise of the Achaemenid Empire. The second phase was an imperial phase as the official religion of Persia. And then we had the third phase, which is a post-Alexandrian phase, where Zoroastrianism would undergo some changes before becoming the official religion of the Sassanid dynasty, and thus of Persia once more. This we can call the 4th period. And then this period would last until the coming of Islam, the 5th period, alongside of which there began numerous persecutions, forcing Zoroastrians underground for some, and into exile in India for others, where pockets of Zoroastrians persist unto this day. These people represent the 6th and modern period of Zoroastrianism. So what binds all these disparate branches of Zoroastrianism is one thing, and that's the worship of divine wisdom. Ahura Mazda is the Lord of wisdom, and it stands to reason that in this conception, the next most important thing in this cosmology is the mind, with a capital M, which is capable of both receiving and expressing that wisdom. This, as you have probably guessed, would be of great importance in the Hermetic tradition. In addition to this mind, we have a third divinity, and that's truth with a capital T, or Asha, as they called it. This was a sort of totality of vision in perfect alignment with what is. And in this sacred union, or trinity, if you will, of wisdom, truth, and mind, a sort of power was generated in the individual, and this power of internal vision, which granted access to knowledge about the inner dimensions of the soul, or the spark of divinity within imparted by Ahura Mazda, with this, the individual could temper themselves through piety and devotion, through performing certain rituals, through abstaining from certain taboos. By doing this, they could produce a sort of indwelling excellence in themselves. And it was this portion of their purified self that became immortal and everlasting. So, to the Zoroastrian, the real world was a moral reality. This physical realm is but a zone of conflict between two great binary powers, and by following the path of light, we can achieve a sort of everlasting union with the principle of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, who is ultimately bound to triumph. In Zoroastrianism, as I've mentioned, there's this concept of a future eon of sorts, where human beings will exist as pure bodies of subtle light in a state of resurrection, and we can only imagine how many people an idea like this would ultimately impact. Through Judaism, through Christianity and other Gnosticisms, through Islam, and so forth. Now, all that being said, there was generally no dogmas or prescriptions as to what the right thing to do was, or what it was important to avoid. This was up to the individual to find out for himself through experience. Zoroastrianism put weight on the individual. Zarathustra said in the Gathas, "I speak to each and every one of you." This was a distinct break from the tribal reality that he was born into, wherein the tribe decided what was good or bad for everyone. At this point now, everyone was personally responsible for the security of their own souls. In a tribal society, this would have seemed exceedingly strange. So the concept of free will here is a revolutionary one. So we can see how this sort of cosmology paralleled the Hindu vision of the world to some degree, and yet also anticipated the various Gnosticisms like Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Christianity, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and so forth. There's this sense that happiness, joy, creation, generation, and so forth are all emanations from some blessed other world behind our senses. But then there's also a principle of polarity at work, a sort of internal antagonism which keeps the whole thing out of stasis, but which may also cause good people to suffer in the process. In this vision of the world, we ultimately reap what we sow. We're the masters of our own destinies. We're fully responsible for the discernment between what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false, what is creative and what is destructive. The Zoroastrian holds to the notion of a final judgment. Negative thoughts, negative words, and negative deeds will be accounted for. So there's a real emphasis on battling this negativity, and the cure to it is knowledge. The image used by the Zoroastrians for the final judgment was that of the Chinvat bridge, which stretched from a great cosmic mountain at the center of the universe all the way to paradise, where it becomes as narrow as a razor's edge, and then only the righteous soul can pass over that distance onward into eternal glory, whereas the evil soul falls from the bridge into eternal damnation. These later became heaven and hell, but the Zoroastrians understood these as states of consciousness. These were not great halls of eternal torment or eternal delight. Now, thinking about this, I'm reminded of a personal anecdote. Sometime 3 or 4 years ago, I was laying on my living room floor, fearing that I might fall off, and then I did. I fell into total blackness, but I remained conscious as a speck of light in a vast darkness. This speck at the center of my mind's eye then elongated into a white pole, onto which a brighter speck could climb up and down according to my emotions in regard to this situation, this loss of body. When I gave into fear, the light climbed down the pole, and then when I completely let go, the light would climb back up the pole. When it reached the top, the blackness was ripped away, and then I beheld this vast and endless jungle. At that point, I woke up. Zoroastrianism helped me to interpret this as a journey between the concepts of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. That speck of light was my will. The axis represented both ends of their polarity. In fear, I remained in darkness, but in love or trust, I was thrown into a vision of this Persian paradise, which was really just a world restored to its pristine state. I had this vision of heaven and of hell, and I can tell you for certain they were not paved with gold or vaulted with brimstone. Now, I digress. Something I really respect about Zoroastrianism is that it privileged the pursuit of knowledge above all things, and this had really terrific results for Persian civilization as a whole. The ancient Persians were magnificent astrologers, mathematicians, artists, magicians, architects, engineers, urban planners, and so forth. And Zoroastrianism had no small part to play in this mass spirit of discovery. I also tremendously respect how there was a sense that harmony in any environment was among the highest goods. And I think that this lies behind the current impetus to call Zoroastrianism the first quote-unquote ecological religion. Nature was revered not reviled, as it would be in many of Zoroastrianism's offshoot Gnostic sects. So among these great thinkers and seekers of knowledge, there was a class of people from Persian society which we today just call the Magi. These men, and they were all men, practiced all manner of arts and sciences, both esoteric and exoteric. These sorts of guys, of course, are most famous for having come to visit Jesus' manger in Bethlehem, having followed the star. And this is a detail in the nativity narrative which was woven in to give legitimacy to the miraculous nature of Christ's birth, because the Magi were all about hunting for and observing ominous births and miracles, especially in the heavens. Perhaps a modern equivalent to this concept would be that the folks at CERN or NASA came from distant lands to witness the birth of your child for some strange reason. Mapping out the heavens and incorporating that data into various rituals and myths was a great preoccupation for your average magus, and we'll see in centuries to come, Persian astrology would have had a profound impact on both Western science and Western religion, particularly occult religion. To the Greeks and the Romans, and even to us today, the Persian magus was the real archetypal sorcerer, astrologer, wizard type, with their pointy hats and their long ornate robes. Our oldest surviving Greek reference to the Magi, which comes from the Greek magos, is from a 6th century BC fragment of Heraclitus, who is actually cursing the Magi for their quote-unquote impious rites and rituals. It was starting with the Hellenistic period that the word magus or magician would ultimately supplant the Greek word goes as a popular word to denote a practitioner of magic, astrology, and other forms of esoteric knowledge. Now, despite this stereotype, the Magi were actually the priests of an imperial cult, and they elaborated Zoroastrianism with their various idiosyncrasies. They were still a hereditary caste, and they assisted with social affairs like the initiation of the young into various mysteries. They performed marriages and funerals. They interpreted dreams and omens, and they gave advice and counsel to ruling elites. They kept their own traditions of sacred hymns alive. Remember that this was mostly an oral tradition. They introduced by a process of syncretism a number of deities, like the astral bodies, as being yazata, or worthy of worship. So, over time, we see them maintaining something along the lines of Hinduism, with a recognition of Brahma at the top being the one in whom all sub-deities are reconciled. Hauma, that hallucinogenic god substance which I was talking about, was one such divinity, and the Magi were the priests of its ritual usage. They were the ones with the astrological knowledge, the calendrical knowledge, the botanical knowledge, and the theological expertise to keep something like a cult of Hauma alive. But they guarded it very carefully, and ultimately they drove it to extinction or complete obscurity. The Magi were technologists of sorts. They created techne, tools, to alter consciousness and to enter the great realities championed by the sacred texts. And this is really the case in a lot of regions around the world. The prophets set the foundations, then the priests elaborate. Zarathustra spoke, the Magi practiced. Now, the last thing I want to say about the Magi is, although the Magi made up a good number of the religious experts in Persia, they were by no means the only ones. There were still old Elamite priests, priests of the old religions of Babylon, Egypt, Israel, Tyre and Sidon, and so forth. These sorts of guys weren't just killed off when the Persians rolled in. Persia was a cosmopolitan empire, and so all of these religious specialists were taken into the Persian fold, and then their traditions were maintained under the greater aegis of Zoroastrian tolerance. In exchange, the priests of Zarathustra would gain all sorts of insight into older Semitic traditions of the Near East, which would have been quite alien to their Median or Persian sensibilities. So the Babylonians were not above adding more gods to their pantheon, and the Magi were not above subordinating old gods like Marduk to their own. Now, here's something which I find incredibly interesting, and this is a notion which ties in very closely with the great bard Terence McKenna's notions about psilocybin's ability to unveil a sort of universal transcendental object at the end of time, if you're familiar with that concept. He used to always link the state of shamanic trance consciousness with a sort of ability to see time as a kind of hyperdimensional object wherein the beginning, middle, and end are all visible at once. Well, Zoroastrianism, as far as I can tell, is the first arguably quote-unquote Gnostic post-agricultural Indo-European religion, and simultaneously the first model to include a fairly fleshed-out eschatology. There's this notion of a future summation of history which spells catastrophe for the physical world, but which is simultaneously coupled with a notion of spiritual transcendence. It's as if the concept of the eschaton was lost and rediscovered, or perhaps simply just discovered all at once, in the mind of a man who was inspired by a plant-induced gnosis. It's as if having that plant gnosis gives one the big picture, and inevitable to this big picture is some kind of end point, whether it be an asteroidal impact, a great flood, a volcanic eruption, a plague, the sun exploding, a tidal wave of molten lead, or something completely unexpected and unimaginable. At the core of Zoroastrianism is the concept that the universe is a gradually evolving entity. It's moving from its baser form toward a state of ideal perfection. There's a built-in teleology here, which is generally so detestable to modern notions of history. This cosmic evolution, however, was thought to have been contaminated by a sort of external counterpoint. This was an object of great vexation to the ultimate Godhead. Immortality, surviving the eschaton, was the stated end goal to the Zoroastrian message. And at the same time, it was believed that the very substance of Haoma itself was thought to confer this immortality. This then sets the agenda for what we ought to do. It determines right thought, right action, and right emotion, then. We are to set ourselves in league with how the world should ideally be, not in league with its fallen, non-ideal nature, and that is how we'll all partake in the ideal kingdom. The purpose of life, then, is, quote, to be among those who renew the world, to make the world progress toward perfection. This, in effect, is a religion of natural law. A righteous action is an action which conforms to how the ideal would have one act, and a wrong action or an evil action, then, is a result of clouded judgment. It's the result of having a stunted faculty of imagination. It happens when an individual can't even imagine what an ideal world would look like, and so they don't bother to participate. It's more a fact of ignorance than outright malice. This malice is then embodied into a principle, and that's the adversarial figure, the shaitan, if you will, Angramanyu or Ahriman. And this is the embodiment of fear, of ignorance, of darkness, and so forth. Now, I strongly believe it's possible that all of these notions were born directly out of Haoma use, whatever it is Haoma was. Now, others might argue that a thing like Haoma is secondary to a religion like Zoroastrianism, that the beliefs came first and then the entheogens just helped them interpret the message. But I come from a different school of thought, and that is the school which believes Haoma is a principle to the Indo-Aryan religious tradition, and that all forms of ritual, myth, and liturgy are merely derivative. Plants come first, religion comes second. Let's not forget then that mind-body dualism, or Trinitarianism in the thought-emotion-deed complex, heaven and hell, free will, messianism, the eschaton, and a whole slew of other concepts that would become so fundamental for later monotheistic systems like Second Temple Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so forth. All of this begins with Zoroastrianism. And now I should add, for the sake of the audience, that in Zoroastrianism we also see the presence of all 7 Hermetic principles at work. These, of course, wouldn't be fleshed out until the 19th century, but it's pretty cool to see them all at work here. So, principle number 1, we have the principle of mentalism. The Zoroastrians believed there to be one universal, transcendent, supreme God, Ahura Mazda. Ahura meaning being, and Mazda meaning mind in the Avestan language. Thus, all is mind and everything is derivative. The principle of correspondence, the second Hermetic principle, features extensively in Persian thought. The conception that that which is above is just as that which lays below was so central to Persian astrology. It was central to planetary magic, to talisman construction. It was also implicit in that sort of shadowy dualistic element of Zoroastrianism. Thirdly, we have the principle of vibration. Everything was moving toward some ultimate teleological eschaton, slowly humming through illusion and truth, back toward the pleroma. Nothing was truly ever at rest. Ahura Mazda's creation, widely agreed upon as Asha, or truth and order, was the antithesis of chaos, druj, falsehood and disorder. And then the idea was that the friction between the two opposed forces is what produced the entire known universe, including humanity, which had an active role to play in this conflict. Now, fourth, we have the principle of polarity. This is the idea that every positive divine aspect has its corresponding negative aspect. So, there is light, and there's darkness, there's truth, and there's falsehood, there's good, and there is evil. This is the principles of polarity and rhythm at work. Next, we have the principle of cause and effect. These are things like the final judgment. These are things that are ultimately logical extensions of the performance of good or bad actions. We often discuss this principle of cause and effect as karma, insofar as every action creates an equal and opposite reaction, and we are accountable for these actions because they create the world around us. Next, we have the principle of gender. In the Gathas, for example, Ahura and Mazda is thought of as one word, Ahura Mazda, but it's created through a conscious union between the masculine word for mind and the feminine word for wisdom. We get sub-deities as well, depicted in both male and female forms, with gender being an important factor in their character. Okay, so maybe a few of these examples give you a sense of how these sort of Hermetic axioms start being expressed theologically. The great Mercurius is at work in history. But as the old mystery schools taught, upon the soul's departure from its shell, it ascended through the 7 planetary spheres, and each gift which the planets gave to man ultimately become a hindrance. So this raiment of Mercury, the patron of the scribe and the priest, is among the heaviest of these historical burdens. While Zoroastrian priests debated theological details through reason and good rhetoric, they set the stage for a world to come, and this would be a world which was not as syncretic and tolerant as their own. This was a world ruled by dogma, by division, by factionalism, by orthodoxy, and by the most painstaking of theological hair-splitting. The ideas of Zarathustra brought the world a great deal of wisdom, but it also founded a model which would grow to become a neurosis in many, namely the neurosis of radical dualism. So we need to keep an eye out for this, and what kind of influence it would have on the world as a whole. Alright, well, I think that covers Zoroastrianism for our purposes. I just want to leave you today with a part of a poem of mine that I feel to be somewhat relevant to today's topic, and then that'll be it. So thank you for listening. Around them were the old deacon demons of the 30th degree, 12 in total for a circle of 360. So many different cases, so many different places were mirrored in the lines of their imagined faces. From here they saw no scales of gold, nor scales of silver skin, no chitin claws, nor carapace, no virgin, and no twins. No curving horns or golden manes, no argent jugs nor bows. Just specks of light so far away, just holes through which God goes.